I'm Mike Wallace, and this is Biography, our story, General Douglas MacArthur. In our time, no American military man has rivaled MacArthur as a dramatic, controversial figure. His name draws immediate, impassioned reactions from soldiers under his command, the enemies he fought, and the people who worked with him. All have their own private image of him. Dwight Eisenhower was an able administrator, George Patton a swashbuckler, George Marshall a statesman. But Douglas MacArthur was all of these. He had a flair, a sense of style, and he carried with him an aura of military grandeur, of purpose, even of mystery. Douglas MacArthur created for himself the image of a legendary hero. He was supremely self-confident, a master strategist. He proved this brilliantly throughout his long career as a soldier. From the very beginning, Douglas MacArthur seemed destined for his military calling. Born January 26, 1880, on this Army post in Little Rock, Arkansas, his earliest memory is the sound of bugles. His father, Captain Arthur MacArthur, is a dedicated career officer in the cavalry, and young Douglas idolizes him. Even as a child, he decides to follow in his father's footsteps. I think, says his father, there is the material of a soldier in that boy. At 19, Douglas MacArthur is admitted to West Point after scoring a near-perfect grade in his entrance exams. In later years, he will say, as an Army brat, this was the fulfillment of all my dreams. Graduation day in 1903, Douglas MacArthur takes all the honors. He's captain of his class. His academic average is an incredible 98, a record that will stand for decades. Assigned to the Philippines as an engineering officer, Lieutenant MacArthur is ordered to make a military survey of the Bataan Peninsula. He gains experience that will be invaluable 40 years later. MacArthur puts in 14 years of peacetime service. On April 6, 1917, America enters World War I. The nation faces the urgent job of creating a wartime army. Watching the slow process of training raw recruits, MacArthur proposes an unorthodox measure. Form a division, he says, out of the best National Guard units in the nation. Senior officers object, because the National Guard had been formed for home defense and not for overseas combat. But President Woodrow Wilson approves the plan and hands Douglas MacArthur the challenge. His orders? Create a new division. From 26 states, thousands of National Guard troops are selected. MacArthur, now a colonel, organizes and trains his division. It will spread over the country, he says, like a rainbow. A statement that gives the 42nd Infantry a new name, the Rainbow Division. Every operation of the Rainbow is planned by MacArthur. Daring, unconventional, he goes out on patrols even behind enemy lines to size up situations for himself. He refuses to carry a weapon and will not wear a helmet. He says, all Germany cannot fabricate the shell that will kill MacArthur. Colonel MacArthur suffers from poison gas twice and is twice wounded in combat. But he refuses to leave the front. The Rainbow Division proves its mettle in some of the bitterest fighting of World War I. As the war ends, MacArthur is promoted to Brigadier General. At 38, he was the youngest man ever to hold that rank. General Blackjack Pershing personally awards him the Distinguished Service Cross. West Point is General MacArthur's first post-war assignment. As superintendent of cadets, most of his attention is devoted to modernizing, streamlining the academic programs at West Point, to institute what he considers vital changes. At the age of 42, MacArthur's career has been marked by success after success. He's known throughout the Army as the Boy General. On November 20th, 1930, Douglas MacArthur reaches a new peak in his Army career. He's appointed Chief of Staff.
Mr. Secretary, I look forward with keen anticipation to my close association with you in the great cause of national defense.
Early in his career as Chief of Staff, he finds himself plunged into an unexpected and tragic drama. It is 1932. Depression grips the nation, and 20,000 World War I veterans march on Washington. This is the bonus march. They've been promised a bonus payable 13 years from now. They're unemployed, and with little chance of finding work, they need the money right away. From all over the country they come. Most of them men who sincerely believe in what they're doing. But they're joined by communist agitators, fanatics, the lunatic fringe. Veterans mass outside the Capitol as Congress debates the bonus bill. Washington police are ordered to disperse the crowd. Resentment, fanned by agitation, turns into rioting. In desperation, President Hoover calls in the Army. His orders to General MacArthur: surround the affected area and clear it without delay. For Douglas MacArthur, this is the most distasteful job of his career. Unwillingly, he is thrown into the middle of this unhappy spectacle. The veterans must be driven out of Washington and their shantytown destroyed. It is to MacArthur's credit that his mission is accomplished without firing a shot, without serious injury either to civilians or soldiers. But MacArthur bears the brunt of public criticism for carrying out the government's order. Upon finishing his term as Army Chief of Staff in 1935, MacArthur accepts a position as military advisor to the Philippine president. His job is to build a Philippine army. His Chief of Staff, Major Dwight Eisenhower. MacArthur must create a fighting force strong enough to discourage an attack on the Philippines. He has to start from scratch. Then, in the summer of 1941, President Roosevelt asks him to take over American forces in the Philippines and to prepare the combined armies, United States and Philippine, for combat. There is now too much to be done and too little time in which to do it. December 7th, 1941, the day of infamy at Pearl Harbor. On December 8th, the Japanese carry the attack to the Philippine Islands. As the ring tightens, General MacArthur is ordered to leave his command post on Corregidor and make his way to Australia. With his wife and son, Douglas MacArthur is ready to start a perilous run through the Japanese blockade. Cannot forget the men he has left behind. To the captive defenders of Bataan and Corregidor, he sends a message of hope, a solemn pledge. I shall return. A hero's welcome greets General Douglas MacArthur when he finally reaches Australia. He is a symbol to the people of the Philippines, to the Australians, and to his own countrymen. He represents the hope of eventual victory in the Pacific. Convoys steam across the Pacific carrying men and arms. For the newly arrived troops, the first job is to consolidate the defenses of Australia. The Japanese threaten the Australian mainland from their bases in New Guinea. To divert the Japanese from an invasion of Australia, the Allies must attack. And so their first offensive action in the South Pacific begins. Target, New Guinea. To MacArthur, the key to warfare is never to take by sacrifice what can be gained by strategy. And his strategy in the South Pacific is to skip over enemy strongholds, attack the weakest points, isolate thousands of Japanese troops from reinforcement and supply. In bitter months of fighting, New Guinea is finally retaken. Then, in July of 1944, MacArthur is suddenly and mysteriously summoned to Hawaii. The president is uncertain about the next step in the Pacific campaign. His first question to MacArthur, "Where do we go from here, Douglas?" The Joint Chiefs of Staff favor striking at Formosa and bypassing the Philippines. But to MacArthur, the recapture of the Philippines is more than a strategic matter. He has promised the Filipinos and his own troops that he will return. At the end of the meeting, FDR tells MacArthur, "You win, Douglas. The Philippines are next." Back in Australia to complete the plans for the invasion, MacArthur sums up his hopes in a speech to members of the Australian Parliament.
2 years ago, when I landed on your soil, I said to the people of the Philippines whence I came, I shall return. Tonight, I repeat those words. I shall return.
Leyte, the Philippine Islands. October 20th, 1944. Douglas MacArthur tells the Philippine people, "I have returned. The promise is fulfilled." MacArthur races against time to save the lives of American soldiers held in the brutal enemy prison camps. Thousands are saved, and MacArthur is there to greet his men. Manila, capital of the Philippines, the last stronghold of the Japanese. It must be retaken block by block, house by house. Corregidor recalls the anguished months he spent in the command tunnels of the island at the beginning of the war. It is a highly emotional moment for Douglas MacArthur.
I see that the old flagstaff still stands. Have your troops hoist the colors to its peak, and let no enemy ever haul them down.
Within the year, World War II ends, and aboard the battleship Missouri, Douglas MacArthur presides over the final formal ceremonies. To this five-star general goes the honor of accepting Japan's surrender.
It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion, a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. A world founded upon faith and understanding. A world dedicated to the dignity of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice.
For Douglas MacArthur, it is the end of one job and the beginning of a new challenge. He's named military governor of Japan. He institutes sweeping changes. Land reform, a new constitution, free and open elections are all part of his program. And for the first time, Japanese women are given the right to vote. A nation recovers from the devastation of war. And to the Japanese, Douglas MacArthur represents a new kind of democracy. In 1948, a campaign is launched to nominate MacArthur for president. He's been away from the United States for 10 years, but he's created the kind of image that has tremendous voter appeal. The movement attracts attention even in Japan. Though he indicates he will serve if called, MacArthur will not leave to campaign in the United States. Thomas Dewey wins the nomination. MacArthur stays to finish his job in Japan. On June 25th, 1950, Communist North Korea breaks the uneasy peace of the Cold War by invading South Korea. American troops sent from Japan slow down the communist drive. General Douglas MacArthur is named commander of the United Nations forces in Korea. With a good part of his troops clinging to a perilous foothold in South Korea, MacArthur suddenly launches an invasion far behind the enemy lines. The daring landing at Incheon takes the North Koreans by surprise. It was considered impossible by most experts, but its success paved the way for a rout of the North Koreans. As his armies press toward the Manchurian border, MacArthur confidently predicts the war will be won by Christmas. Victory is in the air. And President Truman flies to Wake Island to meet and congratulate MacArthur. But just 1 month before the Christmas deadline, 200,000 communist Chinese troops, without warning, launch a massive attack from their base in Manchuria. The communists are stopped only when they advance beyond their lines of supply. And the war in Korea settles down to a deadly stalemate. To break the deadlock, General MacArthur asks Washington for permission to bomb Chinese bases of supply in Manchuria. The request is turned down because the administration says that it fears the Korean action could then spread into a third world war, and MacArthur is directed to make no further public statements on the issue. But as UN commander, he refuses to back down. He wants to use all necessary means to win a clear-cut victory. His insistent agitation finally results in this statement from President Truman.
I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy. It is with the deepest personal regret that I found myself compelled to take this action. General MacArthur is one of our greatest military commanders, but the cause of world peace is much more important than any individual.
Relieved of his command, Douglas MacArthur begins the long journey home. After 14 years, he will return to a hero's welcome and a storm of controversy. In San Francisco, the unrestrained demonstrations begin. In New York, General Douglas MacArthur receives an incredible reception. To the United States and his career as a soldier reach a dramatic climax in an address to a joint session of the United States Congress.
I know war as few other men now living know it, and nothing to me is more revolting. I have long advocated its complete abolition, as its very destructiveness on both friend and foe has rendered it useless as a means of settling international disputes. I am closing my 52 years of military service. When I joined the Army, even before the turn of the century, it was the fulfillment of all my boyish hopes and dreams. The world has turned over many times since I took the oath on the plain at West Point, and the hopes and dreams have long since vanished. But I still remember the refrain of one of the most popular barrack ballads of that day, which proclaimed most proudly that old soldiers never die. They just fade away. And like the old soldier of that ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye.